So I want to talk to you about sheep this morning. In our series, we're talking about ways in which Jesus reveals the Father, and one of the things that Jesus talks about is how God is a shepherd. And anybody here raised sheep? Nobody? Oh, Gloria. Yeah. We didn't have sheep as I was growing up. We did have goats one time until they got out and ate all my own mom's roses. They didn't stay with us very long. My closest experience to raising a sheep was Don Guy bought a lamb and raised it and butchered it, brought us over half the meat, and then we paid for half of it. So that was my closest association to having anything to do with sheep. The other thing I guess I kind of recall is that in some of the Western movies and in some of the books, Western books, there was always this confrontation, this contention between those sheep herders and the cowboys. And the sheep were evil and the cows were good, and so there's always this conflict. And then, of course, we have sheep in a lot of our stories. And in the Christmas story, I mean, sheep are really important. The shepherds are out there, and you have pictures of shepherds and big flocks of white woolly sheep, on the hillsides. And then we have some of the Psalms, and we have pictures of Jesus holding the sheep, and the little lambs. And so I want to look at a few passages about sheep with you this morning. And the first one is in Matthew, and it's in Matthew 25. And I'm going to read this to you, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is going on there. Matthew 25, starting with verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, and take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or go visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I say, whenever you did this for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or strangers or needing clothes or sick or in prison, did not help you?" He replied, "Truly I tell you, whenever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." And then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about what's going on here. And there's actually some inherent problems in this passage that don't clearly come out in the translation, because the word that's translated sheep actually means flocks. It doesn't mean sheep specifically, it means flocks. And I'm going to kind of mess up some of your thinking about some of your ideas about things this morning, but that's sort of just my motif, isn't it? So the word flocks actually refers not only to sheep, but it refers to goats. It could also refer to cattle in some instances, and sometimes even maybe donkeys or horses. And so that generic word encompasses all of those. So he's not specifically talking about sheep and goats. He's talking about flocks and some specific members in the flock. The word that we often translate sheep is the same word throughout the Hebrew and throughout the Greek in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the word shepherd actually is not appropriate, because it is more appropriate to say that it is a flock tender. There is no actual word for shepherd in either Hebrew or Greek. The word is flock tender, and it actually is a business term. It refers to someone who is in management, who is in charge, and it's simply understood in those times that it was a mixture of animals. And the sheep and the goat were both very important to them. In fact, the goats are mentioned throughout. There are some specific words for young goats and young sheep, but when they are adults, they're just called flocks, and it's a combination of them all. The sheep obviously was useful to them for wool and for meat. The goats were useful for them for milk and for meat. They also used the hides of both. And also from the goats, they would glean the undercoat in the spring. There are two ways they did this. One, they actually go out in the wilderness and they would look for the wool, the under hair on the goats that the wild goats would rub off on the bushes. And they would collect that, and actually it's called cashmere. You have a cashmere sweater. It's the under wool from a goat. And it's real fine, and actually it's also, if in the spring when your dog has all that hair it's losing, that's what that is. So you can make a cashmere dog sweater if you want. Which some people do, I guess. I don't know how it smells when it gets wet, but so anyway, the coarse hairs, they would also shear the goats, and the coarse hair they would weave, but they would use it for really tough, hard things because it was coarse and heavy. Curiously, when it talks about John going into the wilderness, and it says that he wore coarse-haired garments, that's what that was made from. And the ascetics believed that you needed to wear something which was coarse because that was part of your journey of kind of suffering. And so they would, but generally that material was not used for clothing, it was used for things like tents. It was really durable, really, really heavy. So they would make heavy-duty packs and things out of the hair coming from the goat. The other thing that was important or significant in this discussion is that the mixed herds were important because sheep are grazers, but goats are browsers. And the difference is that a grazer eats primarily grass, and a browser eats primarily bushes and brush and sprouts and things. They're both ruminants as well as cattle, and so that means that they have several stomachs, and so they eat quickly, and then they go and sit down and they chew their cud, for that expression. But they eat radically different. And so if you put sheep out onto a pasture, they actually will nibble the grass all the way down literally to the roots if you leave them in one place. And this is sort of the tension that happened between cattle and sheep herders, because cattle don't have upper teeth, in spite of the cartoons. They only have a lower set of teeth. They can't bite things off. They actually grab the grass with their tongue and rip it off. So the grass has to be long enough for their tongue to get a hold of in order for them to eat it. But the sheep can eat it closer than that. They can actually get down the grass low enough that a cattle will starve on that pasture. So that was the tension. But it also meant that you have to constantly be moving your flocks. You can't leave them in one area. They'll eat it down into where it won't come back. They'll eat it right down to the dirt. And so a shepherd has to constantly be monitoring the grass and the condition and moving the sheep, moving the goats. And the goats would be working and eating the stuff that the sheep didn't eat. They'd be eating the bushes and things. And goats actually fared better in the hilly country, like around Bethlehem, than the sheep did. The sheep did better down in the lower lands around Jordan because there's more grass, more bushes up on the hillside. So the goats actually did better up there. But these were mixed flocks. And so when you see the picture of the shepherds on the hillside in the Christmas scene, it was a mixture of animals. There were goats, there were sheep, there might be a donkey in there might be a cow in there, but it was a mixed flock. So in this passage, who are the goats that they're calling goats? Now we know they're not goats. And who are the sheep? Although we know they're not sheep. So it's a flock. And I literally spent a lot of hours trying to sort this out and weed out exactly what the intention of these different words were. And here's my conclusion. And I honestly did not find anyone, I found lots of little threads here and there. And so all these threads came together, and this is my conclusion about what's happening. I believe that what he's talking about there are in a flock, There are those members of the flock that pay attention to what the shepherd's doing. And then there are those that are not. And I think that this is what he's talking about here. He's talking about the shepherd, the herder. I'll continue to call him a shepherd, even though he's a herd manager. The shepherd's moving the flocks along. There are these stragglers that are distracted, that aren't paying attention, that are not listening to the shepherd's voice, and they're doing things they're not supposed to be doing. That's the division that I think is being made here, and I think it's further supported by the fact that the real division here is between actions. Isn't that fascinating to you, that Jesus is not making a decision about what these people believe? Isn't that they have to have good theology about Messiah or Messiah coming or Messiah rescuing? It's about their actions in regard to each other. That's the dividing line. And so I think that's why it fits well with my understanding of what those original words are. Okay, let me take it to another passage and we'll talk about something else. And let me just further build on that a little bit in one regard. I was thinking about our ministerial group and the fact that, we sit there in this room. Just this last week, there's probably, 8 or 10 of us there. And I was looking around the room and realizing that we also have some very, very different theologies. And what I mean by that is that we have different understandings of who God is and the behavior God expects and how we're supposed to carry that out. We have very differences in our worship styles and how we practice worship. But we all agree on one thing, and that is that we are here to spread the love of Jesus Christ. And we do that with differences of opinion about what Scripture teaches or even about what Scripture is. How we interpret Scripture, how we read the Bible, how we utilize the Bible, how we view different political things even. We're different politically from one another. And yet we sit there in that room and we are the best of friends. We love each other. We laugh. We make jokes together. And then we just pour our hearts out in praying for our community because we want our community to know the love of God through Jesus Christ. So it comes down to the behavior. It's way more important than our doctrine. And that should be the case of us as well. Our behavior needs to be way more important than our doctrine. Isn't that our doctrine is not important? But I think that it also says to us that Jesus is moving the flock. He's moving the flock. I mean, we don't have the same flock today that we had in Acts. It's a different flock. And we need to be very, very careful that we are constantly being available to God to love the world in maybe ways that we hadn't loved before. And love the people on this planet in ways that we had not loved before. And we do not want to be judged for not loving people, as in this passage tells us. Okay, let's look at another passage. I've got a lot of them to do, so it's okay. The game's not till after 1. We're fine. John chapter 10, very familiar. I mean, everybody knows if you're talking about sheep, John chapter 10, this whole passage about the good shepherd. And again, it's the same word. It's not shepherd, it's flock manager. But I'll use the word shepherd, knowing that you know my new definition now. John chapter 10. I'll just read this. Truly I tell to you, very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out his own sheep, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice, but they will never follow a stranger. And again, every time I'm saying sheep, he's actually talking about flocks. And it's sort of an interesting side. They've discovered that goats are way better at paying attention, vocal attention, than sheep are. And it's often the goats that respond to the shepherd's voice, and then the sheep follow the goats. It's interesting, sort of a... They will never follow a stranger. In fact, they run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore Jesus said again, very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever listens to them, whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd, does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock, that's the right word there, and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father. I lay my life down for the sheep. I have other sheep who are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. The command I received from my Father. The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them say, he is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? So, obviously, whatever Jesus said here was really controversial. And before I get into that, let me talk to you a little bit about flock culture in and around that area at the time of Christ. The first century Jews typically lived in villages. They didn't live remotely, they lived in villages. And there were groups of people that roved around. They were the Bedouins, and they would live in tents, they'd move around, but that was not typically true of the Jewish people. The Jewish people lived in community, and as part of the community, most of the homes had a place in them where they would keep some of their flock, whether it was a cow, whether it was a goat, whether it was a couple goats and a sheep. And every morning, someone would, from the village, this happened a couple different ways as we understand it in studying the archaeology. It seems that sometimes it would be, there would be a kind of a rotation maybe, different people would be in charge of the flock for that day, and so everyone would bring their flock out into the middle of the village perhaps, and then the flock manager would take the flock out and spend the day taking them around different places to eat. And it seems like that probably was rotated. And then in the evening they would come back, and then each flock person would call, and their animals would separate from the herd and come in to where they would get fed and stay the night. At times, perhaps when things were really busy or whatever, they would hire outside people. Maybe the Bedouins would be people they would hire, and then the Bedouins would take the sheep out. And so that's the contrast between someone who actually owned parts of the flock versus someone who didn't. And he's talking about that difference there. But what is the real issue that's going on here? Because obviously the religious leaders were really unhappy with these words. And the real tension here is when Jesus said that he has flocks who are not part of this flock. He has animals, sheep and goats and cattle and things who are not part of this flock. And that was really, really offensive to them because they believed that they were exclusively God's. They were God's chosen people, and the rest of the world, in order to get to God, had to come through them. And now Jesus is saying, actually, that's not true. I did come into this nation and create this nation to be a vehicle to me to the world, but you know what? I'm using other vehicles as well. I've told you this story before, but I'm reminded of a missionary story. I think it was in Irian Jaya or Papua New Guinea. They went to a remote area and they began talking about Jesus and the fact that God had sent his son to redeem the world. And they said, oh yeah, we know all about him. But we know that he exists, but we want you to teach more about it. They knew the existence of God and that he'd sent a son, that there was this passage made for them. They'd connected to the Creator God, but they were so excited to have someone come and give them more information about this message they already knew. So I believe that what Jesus is saying here is that we need to allow God to work in our world in however he wants. and that we simply need to be the conveyors of the message that we have to a world that's desperately lost, but who God is determined to bring salvation to in any means that he wants. I was thinking about the best way to do that. And it seems to me, especially in this political time, that, it's very obvious to us how politically divided the climate is in our country right now. And there are people in this room that are very conservative, and there are people in this room that are very liberal. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but I'm very much aware of that. And you probably don't talk about politics with each other, but you smile and love each other anyway. And but you know what? I think that we as Christ followers need to adapt a different way, what some people are calling the third way. And that is that I don't identify myself as a Republican. I don't identify myself as a Democrat. I identify myself as a follower of Jesus Christ. And that my politics are in line with that. So as each candidate comes, it doesn't matter to me if they're Republican or Democrat or anything else about them. It's whether or not they are moving our nation and our world to be more in alignment with what God wants of it. And that is so evident throughout the New Testament. So that's the position that I think we as Christ followers really need to work toward to begin to heal this incredible divide in our country. It doesn't matter. And, I know that there are some believers that think that if you're not in this political party, you couldn't possibly be a believer. And I know really committed believers that are in all spectrums of the political. So I want to talk to you about sheep this morning. And I believe that we can in our series, we're talking about ways in which Jesus reveals the Father. And one of the things that God or Jesus talks about is how God is a shepherd. And they believe. Anybody here raised Jesus sheep? Talked about in that first passage. Nobody? How are we carrying those people? Yeah. We didn't have sheep as I was growing up. We did have goats one time until they got out and ate all my own mom's roses. They didn't stay with us very long. My closest experience to raising a sheep was Don Guy bought a lamb and raised it. Probably could have done a sermon series butchered it, shepherds, brought us over half the meat, and then we paid for half of it. So that was my closest association. Matthew 18. To do with sheep. The other thing I guess I kind of recall is that in some of the Western movies and in some of the books, Western books, there was always this confrontation, this contention between those sheep herders and the cowboys. It's Matthew, beginning with verse 10. It says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that the angel in the Christmas story, their angels in heaven always see the face of you have pictures of shepherds. And what do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look one that's wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing. I want to look at a few passages about sheep with you this morning. So, and the first one is in Matthew story because it doesn't make economic sense. It's in Matthew 25. If you have a flock, and your flock's doing okay. I'm going to read this to you, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about. But you look around and one of your goats or one of your cows or one of your sheep is missing. You think, okay, Matthew 25, starting with verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, and take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or go visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I say, whenever you did this for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, is
did
amazing
for me.
in the sense that
Then he will say to those on his left,
exactly
depart
just
from me,
to
you who are cursed,
I don't have
into
to
the
adapt
eternal
so
fire
that,
prepared for the devil and his
so that I
angels.
connect with
For I
the
was
God
hungry,
of-
and you gave me
of
nothing to
Rhonda
eat.
or
I was
Tim
thirsty, and you gave me nothing
or
to drink. I was a
Sandy.
stranger, and you didn't
I
invite
can
me in.
connect to him
I needed
because
clothes,
he
and you did not
connects
clothe me.
simply
I
to
was sick
me.
and in prison, you did not look
An
after me.
amazing shepherd.
They also will answer,
It
Lord,
isn't
when did
just
we
the
see
99
you
he cares
hungry or
about.
thirsty
He
or
cares
strangers
about
or needing clothes or
one
sick or in
particular
prison did not
sheep.
help you?
Me.
He replied, truly I tell you, whenever you did
And I
not
can
do
have
for one of the least of
unique
these, you did not do
relationship
for
that
me.
no one else
And
ever
then
has, no
they
one
will
else
go away
ever
into
will.
eternal punishment, but the
He's
righteous
that
to eternal life.
He's that
All right.
complex. He's that
So,
amazing.
Let me tell you a little bit about what's
You
going
get
on here. And
get
there's actually some inherent problems in this passage that don't clearly come out in the translation,
is
because
our
the word that's translated sheep
flock
actually means flocks.
We are
It
the
doesn't
flock
mean sheep
of his
specifically, it
pastures.
means flocks. And
Sheep,
I'm going to kind
goats,
of mess up
cows,
some of your
sometimes a
thinking
donkey
about
here or
some
there.
of your ideas about
Maybe a
things
jackass
this
or
morning.
two.
But that's sort of just
We're
my motif, isn't it? Stand up and let me
conclude us with prayer.
So the word flocks actually refers not only to sheep, but it refers to goats. It could also refer to cattle in some
May
instances,
God
and sometimes
bless
even
you.
maybe donkeys or horses. And so
know
that
that
generic
your
word
actions are important?
encompasses all of those. So he's not
know, that's
specifically talking
what
about
is
sheep
important
and
is how we
goats. He's
love our
talking about
planet
flocks and some
and that
specific
you get
members in the flock.
all to yourself.
And the word that we
So I'm
often
talking about
translate
sheep
this morning is the same word throughout the Hebrew
in our series,
and throughout the Greek
we're
and the
talking
Old
about
Testament,
ways
New
in which
Testament.
Jesus
And the word
reveals the
shepherd
Father, and
actually
one of the
is
things
not
that,
appropriate
God-
because
or Jesus
it is
talks about is
more
how
appropriate to say that it is
God
a
is a
flock
shepherd.
tender. And there is no
Anybody here
actual word
raised
for
sheep?
shepherd in either Hebrew or
Nobody?
Greek. The word is flock
Oh,
tender.
Gloria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It actually is a business
we
term.
didn't
It
have
refers to
sheep
someone who
as
is
I
in
was growing up. We
management,
did have
who is in
goats one time
charge,
until they got out
and
and
it's
ate all
simply
my mom's
understood in those
roses. They
times
didn't
that it was
stay
a
with us very long.
mixture of animals.
My
And,
closest
the sheep and the goat were both
experience to
very
raising a
important
sheep
to
was
them.
Don Guy bought
in
a
fact, the
lamb
goats are mentioned
and
throughout.
raised
There
it
are some specific words
and
for young goats
butchered
and
it,
young sheep.
brought us over half
when
the
they are
meat, and then we
adults,
paid
they're
for
just
half of
called
it.
flocks,
So
and it's a
that was my
combination of
close
them all.
association to having to do
The
with
sheep obviously was useful to them for wool,
But,
and for meat.
yeah,
the goats were
other
useful
thing
for
I
them
guess I
for
kinda
milk.
recall is
and
that in
for
some of the
meats,
Western
they also
movies
used the
and in
hides of
some of
both.
the books,
And
Western books, there
also
was always
from the
this
goats, they
confrontation,
would
this
contention between
glean
those
the
sheep
undercoat
herders
in
in
the
the spring.
and
And
the
the two ways they did
cowboys.
this one, they actually
And,
go out in the
the
wilderness
sheep are
and they
evil
would,
and the
they
cows
would
were
look
good,
for
and so there's always
the
this
wool, the
conflict.
under,
And then, of course, we have
the under hair
sheep
on the
and all of our
goats that
stories
the wild
in the
goats
Christmas
would
story.
rub
I
off
mean,
on the
sheep are
bushes.
really important.
And
The
they would
shepherds
collect
are out
that,
there,
and actually
you have
it's
pictures
called
of
cashmere. You
of
have
shepherds
cashmere
and
sweater.
big flocks
It's
of
the under
white woolly
wool
sheep, you know,
from a goat
on the hillside.
and it's real fine.
And then we have
actually it's also some of
your-
the like the Psalms
in the
spring when your
we have
dog has
pictures
all
of
that
Jesus
hair
holds in the
lizard
sheep,
deep, you
what
know,
that
and
is.
the little lambs.
So you can make a cashmere dog sweater.
So
if
I
you want.
want to look at a few passages about
which
sheep
some
reading
people
this
do, I
morning.
guess.
And the first one is
I don't
in
know how it
Matthew.
smells when it gets wet, but
And
So
it's
anyway,
in Matthew 25. The coarse hair, they
gonna
would
read this
also
to you, and
shear
then
the
I'm gonna talk
goats,
a little bit
and the
about,
coarse hair they would weave,
what I
but
think
they
is
would use
going
it
on
for
there.
really tough, hard things because it was coarse and heavy.
Matthew 25,
Curiously,
starting
when
with
it
verse
talks about
31.
John going into
When the Son of
into the
Man
wilderness,
comes
it
in
says
his
that he
glory and
wore
all the angels with him, he will
coarse-haired
sit on
garments.
his glorious
That's what that
throne.
was made from.
All the
And
nations will be
ascetics
gathered
believed that
before
you
him, and
needed
he
to
will
wear something
separate
which
the
was coarse
people
because that
one
was
from
part of your
another as a
journey
shepherd
of kind of
separates
suffering.
the sheep from the
And so
goats.
they would- but
He will
generally
put the
that
sheep on his
material was
right
not
and the
used for
goats on
clothing,
the
it was used
left.
for things like tents.
Then the
It was
king will
really
say to
durable,
those on
really-
his
really
right,
heavy.
"Come, you who are
So
blessed
they
by
would
my
make
Father,
heavy-duty